Got it. Oh, you know what? I'm going to change my name because I'm using my work account. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Good. Let me just,
Nice.
let's see here. There we go. Oh, that's not the one I want. Just give me 1 second, like I said. There we go.
Nice. Hey,
There we go.
nice. Well, thank you so much, Notes, or Michael, however you want to be referred to. Yeah.
Yeah, either works.
Yeah, for taking the time to have an interview. And um, normally it's funny because I've been doing quite a bit of interviews with many other prog bands or artists, and
Mhm.
in the past. In fact, a couple days ago, I interviewed Fido, and
Oh, right on. Love
yeah,
Fido.
yeah, and I mentioned to him that you got me into him, and because you did an interview with him in like 2018, and
Hmm.
he said I owe him and send him my regards. So
Oh, thank you. That's so
yeah,
nice.
yeah, and I just had to say that because it's absolutely true. I mean, if it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't have gotten into Fido at all, and he's one of my favorite artists. So
So
yeah,
good.
exactly right. And that leads me to actually the first question that I was going to ask: what is your favorite Fido album?
Ooh. Well, it's the one that got me into it, which was Doomsday Afternoon. I mean, I listened to that when it first came out in 2007, so I was just in my like deep dive into newer prog stuff because I was really into the 70s prog and I'm like, oh, no good music has been put out since like 1980. But that album came out and I was starting to get into Spock's Beard and Flower Kings and a bunch of the other kind of like retro symphonic prog stuff, and I was like, this is good, this is all right, but like it doesn't really capture anything modern. I use the term retro prog because it's not really advancing the music forward at all. Like it's leaning very heavily on the 70s motif, which I love. But yeah, when I heard Doomsday Afternoon, I'm like, this is what progressive rock really should be. Like it progresses the music forward. It's a progressive rock outfit. And since then, I think all of his albums have been full on masterpieces, like 10 out of 10. But like that was the one that got me into it. And I still consider it probably within my top five favorite albums of all time. So yeah.
I can't really disagree with you at all. I actually agree with you full on.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I have a similar story to you where my dad was the person who got me into prog, just like
Yeah.
your dad was the person who got you into prog.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
uh, um, it's funny how eventually, we were the person influencing the people who influenced us initially, and
Yep.
bringing back music in that kind of style. So I introduced my dad the album Tuesday Afternoon by Fido, and that's one
Mhm.
of the few albums that I've shown him that he actually really gravitates towards a lot and really likes.
Oh,
And
that's fun.
it's a masterpiece. It's just amazing.
Hmm.
And yeah, I agree with you. All the albums that he's released subsequently, maybe with the exception of All Is Number, which but which is yeah, I
Yeah.
still really like
Even
the idea
I,
of
I was gonna say, like, even he doesn't really consider it an album. It's
it.
more of like an art form, right? It's it's
Exactly.
it's art that has been put to audio. And yeah, it's like I think I've listened to that record twice all the way through, and I'm good not listening to it again. It was a really good art piece, but
Yeah,
I don't necessarily consider it an album. I consider it an art piece.
yeah, and it's very different from anything he's done. And but even like
Hmm.
the albums released prior to that, I like The Great Leap a lot. 313
Hmm.
has great songs. Ghost
Yeah,
Story, which I
love it.
think you like a lot. Yeah,
Yep.
Chupacabras. It
Yep.
just his whole discography I really like. Even the more psychedelic kind of folk
Hmm.
stuff. But yeah, I just had to mention that because he said multiple times, "Give him my regards," and I was like,
Oh, that's so
absolutely.
nice.
Yeah.
I have to reach out to him because his new album's coming out in the fall, and I'm really hoping to get a copy of it so I can review it and really promote it for him. So
Yeah, he was talking about that in my interview that I did for with him, and we kind of got into some interesting topics. But he mentioned the new album and how there's
mhm.
it's kind of in the vein of like Elton John, Goodbye Yellow
Okay.
Road, or like part of it is, or like even what is it? like Hunky Dory, David Bowie, right? Or
Right.
but then there's this one like kind of prog song that's like 14 minutes long that is called
Amazing.
the I forgot something of Mary Joe or something. The Chronicles of I don't know what it is. Something epic.
That's all
It's
right.
something like epic sounding. Um,
Amazing.
yeah, right. And
Mhm.
it's one of those songs where we were kind of getting into a little bit of like spirituality, and he was like saying, "Oh, something like that was a song that some other force guided me to make." So
Right.
he's very
Yeah.
much hyping it up, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so excited," But yeah, that was very exciting. Now, I didn't really have to do much research for this interview because I've been following your channel, as I said, for probably well since like 2018. So for
Well,
like five.
thank you.
Yeah, and I am well a massive fan. I think the first video that I saw of yours was probably your most popular, like highest viewed video, which is the Yes Worst to Best. I don't know if it's your most now.
What's odd is my most popular like my most popular video is a video essay I did on the Lorax. Because
Oh,
I always look through my analytics, and that one is like 3 or 4 times more viewed than my second highest view, which is like 100,000. Like I'm on like 3 or 400,000 with, and it's just this kooky little thing where like I know I'm getting a little off topic, but like it's me analyzing the original song that was supposed to be used for like the Lorax, or not the Lorax, the Onceler's um disregard for the environment in favor of capitalism. And the original song was going to be called Biggering, and it was like this really proggy, show tuney piece that I love. And they recorded like a pretty substantial demo for it, but it was too dark for a kids movie, so instead they put Biggering on instead, which is just this fun rock pop kind of throwaway track. And so I do a little bit of a deep dive comparing the two tracks and why Biggering is much better than how bad could it be. So that's my favorite, or my not my favorite. it's it's
Yeah.
one of those, like, I don't want to say I begrudge it, but I'm very honored that it's getting the traction that it has. But it's like those one hit wonder bands that's like, that's the one that got me famous.
Yeah.
That's nothing like my actual videos that I put out.
Yeah, it's very
um
interesting how the algorithm works and
yeah, and
chooses
even
certain.
to this, like, even to this day, like I have weekly analytics, and that one gets another 3 or 400 views each week. And I'm lucky if some of my newer reviews or videos get that throughout the week. So
Mhm.
sorry, I kind of took away your question or
No, no,
your
that's fine.
comment there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I want. Well, yeah. The Lorax one is the most popular, but I think it was like the second most popular, which is the Yes one, and
Yeah, it's either
eventually,
Yes or Genesis or one of those
yeah,
worst to best. Yeah.
yeah, and then eventually, it's funny because Genesis, they're kind of regarded as one of the more influential, maybe '70s prog
Mhm.
bands, but it was more Yes that I first heard.
Mhm.
The only Genesis I knew at the time was the '80s stuff. So
Sure. Yeah.
Invisible Touch and all that stuff. Um, and I really like that. So I was like, I had kind of heard of how they had a kind of a more experimental beginning side.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I was always intrigued by their album covers. I think it was my uncle who recommended to me Foxtrot. And I
Yeah.
didn't, it's weird because, I, I needed somebody else to show me how great this music was because it was just him over the phone. He was like, "Oh, you should listen to Foxtrot," and I was like,
Right.
probably 10 or whatever. And
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't really. It's kind of hard to really gravitate towards it. But when I listened to your review of those albums, right, the worst to best, I was
Mm-hmm.
so just I was totally hooked on everything that you were
Oh,
saying, just alone
amazing.
your reviews of it, and then I listened to it, and then of course it blew me away. And they're
Right.
in my probably top three bands of all time. I think up there
So
with
good.
Marillion and the Flower Kings, right, as being my favorite band of
Amazing.
all time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting because for the most part, and I would say you're definitely much more. I mean, you've been listening to music a lot longer than I have, so you have much more of a broad kind of palette to choose from in terms of the bands that you listen to. I kind of go
Mm-hmm.
through many different phases of bands that I listen to and stick to one
Yeah.
band at a time normally. But anyway, at least my leads me to my question. So there are some
Mm-hmm.
bands that you really like that for some reason I just can't really like understand.
Uh-huh,
And I've
uh-huh.
tried really hard. I have tried really hard, or maybe they're bands that at one point I did like, and then I kind of moved on to other bands, and then I returned to them, and I just didn't get them. But
Mhm.
one of those bands, well, actually, it's kind of a multiple bands grouped into one. Anything that Steven Wilson has been a part of, I just don't get. I really
Okay.
don't get it. I even Porcupine Tree, or um, you know, even some of the other projects like No Man and Storm Corrosion and
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah.
else?
Yeah, he has got lots. Blackfield is another
Yeah,
one.
Blackfield. Yep, yep, yep.
I
I
think that's his
just
other big one.
I
Yeah.
just find him, and even like watching interviews with him, I find him so pretentious. Not even in like a charming way, like in a
Gotcha.
like in a
Gotcha.
negative way. And honestly, his music, I just don't see it as great as the mass public does. And I'm just
Sure,
curious to
sure,
see
sure.
like what is it that you seem to like about him that maybe I just don't understand.
No worries. So I actually want to address the framing device you used for the question first. In terms of, because it started to get me thinking. I 100% I'm going to answer this, but like, um, I I want, a lot of people have always come up to me. It's like, hey, I don't like this artist or this musical style that you seem to love. How can I like it, or what am I missing? And my always take home message is like, well, tastes change. Not everybody can like the same thing, and that's what makes us so interesting as people. um, but I also kind of think of like, if it's something that you want to enjoy, it's kind of like flavors of food, right? Like our actual bodies go through a change every 7 years where we replace ourselves. So tastes, both physically in terms of the tactile taste of food, changes 7 years, because that's when our cells regenerate. And I think the same kind of goes for music as well. So like, if it doesn't connect now, don't try to force it. Like, put it on the shelf, maybe return to it every couple of years or so to see if the tastes have changed, or whatever brought you to the table has a different kind of context or things like that. And never try to force it. That's one surefire way of not enjoying something, is sitting yourself down and putting yourself through misery for something that's not going to work. So
Yeah.
because I've done that in the past for certain, like the musical style of Zool, specifically with Magma. Like, I am not a big fan of that style, and I listen to not only Magma but a bunch of other Zool types of music, and I just never got into it, and I forced myself, and I hated the entire experience. And I return to it maybe once a year just to see if something is connecting or clicking, and it hasn't yet, but I haven't completely written it off. But I've also stopped trying to, I guess, force myself to like it. Right? It's just not for me. Um, yeah, in regards to the actual Stephen Wilson and why I like it, like, it's very interesting. For the longest time there, begrudgingly, Stephen Wilson was kind of the face of modern progressive rock, like contemporary progressive rock, always on the cutting edge. I mean, Porcupine Tree was one of the first in the 90s to really infuse the Brit indie pop rock stuff that like Radiohead and Muse were playing with, but in a little bit more of a progressive rock styles. And he begrudged that kind of progressive rock tendency. He never wanted to embrace it, and yet he's put out some of the, in my opinion, some of the best progressive rock that we've currently had, that represents where the music was at that time. um and I think what really, for me, I really enjoy his production side of work. And that's part of the reason why he's gone through and he's done a lot of the remixing and remastering of a whole bunch of different classic albums, and even not so classic ones. Like tomorrow, we get to finally listen to Richard Wright's Wet Dream album from Pink Floyd that he's remastered and he's done. And like, outside of like die-hard Pink Floyd fans and specifically Richard Wright fans, I don't think anybody really knows about those albums. So he's kind of shining the light on some of those other works. So I loved his production side of things. All of his 5.1 surround sound stuff sounds incredible. There are projects from him that I like more than others, I would say, though. Even with Porcupine Tree, like there are certain albums from Porcupine Tree that I'm even like, this is a little too much, a little too pretentious. And he still has not perfected the landing on a concept album, because he's done multiple concept albums, but I always feel as though he's kind of fudged the landing. And that goes to like Fear of a Blank Planet, as well as like Hand Cannot Erase, which are a little bit more narrative and have a little bit more of a constant flow. It's just, I feel as though he handles concept albums the same way that like Roger Waters does, where it's there, it's kind of consistent, but it starts to get muddled about halfway through. So I think that was like the major draw, is just he was the one that started to get recognition. And I think if anybody knows like progressive rock in the 90s and 2000s, I think the first idea that they get is like Steven Wilson. So he's kind of like the poster child. And I think that fed into itself. And then he's done so many different projects by so many different people. And he was also the producer of some really prominent albums like Blackwater Park from Opeth. And a lot of people consider that to be one of the best, death metal, progressive metal albums ever. So yeah, I think it's all kind of interwoven and intertwined, but yeah, I would call myself a really big fan of his, and I've seen him multiple times, but there are definitely other acts that I like a lot more than him, right?
Yeah,
So
and I totally forgot to mention his production, which is
mhm.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
So good. I mean, that is something that I can totally praise him for, because he's produced the King Crimson albums that I've listened to, and
Mhm.
Gentle
Mhm.
Giant, and all sorts of bands, obviously, yes, and
Yeah.
so many great classic bands. And
Yeah, I
that
think he
kind
did a
of,
bunch of Jethro Tull albums as well.
yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah.
And he even produced I think he produced that, oh my gosh, that one Fish album. I forgot what it's called, but
Yeah.
yeah,
And I also love the fact that he'll go out on the limb and try more independent stuff. Like there was an Israeli artist called Efrat, and he only put out one album, and I consider it a masterpiece. Daniel Gilden Lowe from Pain of Salvation appears on one of the tracks, and it's one of my favorite records. And here's Steven Wilson producing this small independent artist from Israel. That's just, and it's amazing. It's one of the best prog rock, and I would say it's a rock album first and a progressive rock album second. It ends on a 20-minute epic.
yeah.
It's so good, and I always recommend it to people.
I I used to listen to it a lot, like
Yeah.
right when I first saw that video that you did. Oh, well, not right when it came out, but when I first saw it, I was like, oh my gosh. And I was trying to listen to all the Masterpiece Theater albums that you reviewed,
No.
and just to like
Amazing.
really just get a taste of everything. And that was one I really liked. And then eventually I kind of moved on to other things and stopped listening to
Sure.
it entirely.
Yeah,
But
it
I need
happens.
to revisit it. I need to revisit it. Especially, I didn't know Daniel Gildenlow was on it. And I'm
Yeah.
now a huge Pain of Salvation fan. Like I've been listening to them
Oh,
a lot.
great.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
cool that
he's
he did.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's on the second last track, the Sum of Damage Done, I think it is. The ending of that track is just, I weep
Yes.
every time.
I remember there's a song called The Show, I think.
Hmm.
And that's the first one. That's the
Yeah,
opening track. Okay, yeah,
I
yeah.
believe so.
Yeah. I like that one. I forget the rest, but I think there's one track with like a female vocalist, I think, or female vocals or something.
I
Yeah.
think so. Yeah, I think that's the last track that has a couple female parts in it.
Okay. I
I think
Yeah,
so.
there's certain things I remember, but because I used to listen to
Yeah.
it a lot, and I'm sure it would flood back to me the moment I listened to it again. But
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
it's Porcupine Tree, Steven Wilson. It's not that I don't like him.
Hmm.
It's anything but. I really want to like him,
Hmm.
especially
Hmm.
maybe because of just how like sort of famous and reputable he is within the prog sphere, if you will. But
Hmm.
there's other bands as well that kind of fall into this category. I think one band that well, actually both bands I think you really like because you did a couple of videos on them, the Mars Volta and Tool. Um,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
I, and then again, there are also bands that I used to like at one point, and then eventually
Hmm.
I just returned to their music, and I couldn't even get through an entire album. Like I couldn't even
Okay.
get through Lateralis entirely, or Lateralis, however you want to pronounce it, or
Yep. Yep. Yep.
what is it? I think the debut Mars Volta album, I had a really
Oh,
hard time listening to that all the way through. It's just hard. It's just a
I,
painful album to listen to. Just for me. But then again, I
I
don't.
no, that's
Yeah,
fine. Like I remember because I was introduced to the Mars Volta by a really good friend of mine, and she was like, "You're going to love this," and she got me to listen to Octahedron, and I fell in love with it. And then I went and, searched them up, and it's like, oh, you gotta listen to Deloused. Deloused, their debut is like the best record that's ever been made. And I listened to it, and I'm like, this is unlistenable. Like,
Yeah.
this is way too weird. It's way too strange. They're going way too fast. They need to slow down, and like, it's all over the place. I can't catch anything. It's like walking through a massive swarm of bees, and I can't catch anything. And I still, there's a few tracks on there that I really love. Like, I love the first track. I love um the slower song on it. I think the second last track and the final track.
I
Um,
That track I
you
also,
know,
that's the only track I actually really like on the album. It's Televators, I think.
Televators.
Yes, that's a
Yeah.
great song. Yeah.
Yeah, but like the rest of the album, I pretty much could take or leave. And it wasn't until I listened to Francis the Mute that it clicked for me. And it's still one of my favorite records. Like, I love Francis the Mute. Everything worked so well. It's so well constructed. And after listening to that, I grew to appreciate Deloused. It's still not my favorite of theirs, and I know I get a lot of flack for that because a lot of people consider it their masterpiece, and I can understand that. But yeah, I think it's just, again, the tastes change, the tastes develop, and I think we as people go through our lives being, changed based on context, where we are, the experiences we've had. And it's interesting. Like, I have a very similar experience with a much more popular, very not prog band of like My Chemical Romance. When they first came out, when I was in high school, I couldn't stand them. I was like, these are whiny, pretentious, comic book loving nerds. And I'm a comic book loving nerd myself, but like, I don't appreciate the music that they're putting out. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I gave it another spin, and I'm like, oh, this is actually really good. I actually really love this. And I have subsequently gone back and I've listened to their whole discography, and I've really fallen in love with it. But it's just kind of where we are when we are at those specific times. So
Definitely,
yeah.
definitely. And now I'm kind of gonna. I mentioned. Are there any bands that, I mean, that maybe you kind of feel the same way about that I do towards Porcupine Tree, that you don't like get per se, but you maybe
Hmm.
want to like? I don't know.
Yeah, like I had that, as I mentioned, with Zool and Magma. I've
Yes.
kind of stopped doing that. Like, I'll always give a band a chance, and I'll always give a band the benefit of the doubt, but like, I've no longer really force myself to like anything, and if I don't connect with it, I just kind of move on, because there's so much music out there now that this is going to sound super pretentious, but I honestly just don't have time. Like, I don't have time to waste on a band that I don't connect with. And if there's a band that is getting a lot of recognition, and I think the only one that I can think of currently within like the current climate of where we are is like a band like Sleep Token, which is getting so much recognition and is getting so much praised. And I have a lot of like friends within the reviewer scene that is just fawning over this record, and I'm just kind of bland to it. I'm like, it's fine. I can understand why people are enjoying it because it's a mixture of different genres in a metal expression, but I don't care. Um, like, I would much rather listen to and spend my time with other bands that I genuinely enjoy, rather than trying to force myself to analyze and figure out what it is that I'm not getting or something like that. It's like, okay, I've heard it. I don't need to listen to it again. I'll check out a Sleep Token album if it comes down the line again. Um, but I'd much rather spend my time with, albums that I do enjoy. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was. It was funny. I was in a band, and the drummer, she was obsessed with Sleep Token,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah. Then again, I just didn't really get it. I could still somewhat maybe appreciate it given, the person who recommended it to me, but I just at the same time it wasn't, you. And I totally agree. It's weird because with Prague, it's kind of, they make it so that like so many people are like, oh, just keep listening until you get it. I
Mm-hmm,
hear so
mm-hmm,
many people who
mm-hmm.
are like that, and sometimes you just have to accept that not everything is gonna click for you, at least in the time and place that you're currently inhabiting.
Yeah,
And
like,
so, yeah.
and that is something very specifically to Prague. Like, I remember, what, like, Tales of Topographic Oceans from Yes. Like, I remember listening to that when I was in high school, and just not getting it. And but there was still something there that drew me back. And I think that is what is needed. There needs to be something of interest. There needs to be something that like entices me to come back to it. And so with an album like that, yeah, it took multiple listens to really get and appreciate, but there was this need, there was this fascination. There's like, what am I there's something that's drawing me to this, and I'm enjoying the process of discovering this album. You
Yeah.
know, Emerson Lake and Palmer's album Tarkus was another one for me that took a long time for me to really really get into. It wasn't like Trilogy or Brain Salad Surgery, which was like an immediate love. This one took multiple listens to really really love. And I think the perfect example of this would be The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from Genesis. Like that first disc is so accessible, it's so inviting, and the second disc very much is not. And I've had this conversation with a number of my friends that love that album, and we would say, "Oh, I love that first disc. The second disc I can kind of take or leave." But now it's like I love that second disc, and the first disc I can kind of take or leave.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there needs to be that draw. There needs to be that pull into the album.
Yeah. I love off the second disc, Silent Sorrows and Empty Boats. That is one of
Mm-hmm.
the haunting Genesis songs, or even The Waiting Room is so good.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I love those songs, and they're kind of underappreciated. I don't feel like
Yeah.
people really mention
Yeah.
them a lot, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally, yeah.
Absolutely.
And oh my gosh, I was going to mention something.
No worries.
Sorry, I totally forgot what I was going to say. It's something along those lines. Oh, I remember. A more extreme example of an album that personally I love that took a lot of listens, but it was always had that enticing kind of factor about it or element to it. It's Captain Beefheart, Trout Master,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
I
that's
absolutely adore that
classic.
album. I adore that
Sure.
album. It's so great, and it's one of those albums where it's like it technically doesn't make sense, but it at the same time it does, because
Mm-hmm.
everything was intentional, and that changes your perspective of the album. The fact that
Yeah.
this everything has intent. It's not just randomness.
Yeah.
And as a musician, I also appreciate it. But even if you're not a musician, I feel like there's something to truly love
Oh, sure.
so much of that music, including a lot of prog. Um,
Oh, absolutely.
and something that you also mentioned earlier, about Porcupine Tree, how they're kind of taking elements of like Radiohead and even like
Mm-hmm.
Muse to a certain extent. It's funny because I love those bands. I love those bands because I find them to be a bit more um, experimental, I would say. I don't
Yeah.
know. I find them a little bit more experimental. I feel like Porcupine Tree, I don't know. It just doesn't really grab me in the same way. But then again, I love Radiohead and Muse. But at the same time, I'm still not giving up on that band. So I'm still gonna try even harder, because it's not like a band that it's not like Mars Volta or Tool to the same extent where it almost pains me to listen to them sometimes.
Sure. Sure.
It's a
Sure.
little bit different. There's still that factor, but and then I know you are a big fan of Taylor Swift. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, and you're typically known as a progressive rock music critic, I guess, on YouTube. But you
Yeah.
still really like Taylor Swift, and I have to say, Taylor Swift, I actually really do enjoy. I enjoy more of her folky stuff, but also
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
a pop artist that I like, huge pop artist, Harry Styles. I really
Mm-hmm.
like. I really love
Mm-hmm.
him, and it was actually, um, yeah. I didn't get into him on my own. It was like my peers, who
Yeah.
recommended his music to me, because he's liked by so many people, and even like power pop, which has elements
Mm-hmm.
of progressive music, like Jellyfish, which I still think
Oh,
is
yeah.
sort of like a proggy has proggy
Yeah.
elements to it, sort of in the same way like Radiohead has proggy elements. I don't know, but why is there a stigma towards pop music, and why do you think that may be?
Huh. Well, I think there's definitely like the elitists out there who hold those stigmas for sure. Like, and when I was a teenager, I definitely had that kind of stigma about it. It's like, oh, well, if it's not Marillion or if it's not, Genesis or Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer or King Crimson, they got music, they wrote better music than pop musicians can. Um, and I think that's a very ignorant stance. I think that there's no better or worse music. There's just levels of connection and enjoyment. And for some people, they love that kind of music. And that's perfectly fine because they'll listen to the Mars Volta and think that it's complete garbage. And for them it is. So I think that there shouldn't really be any kind of stigma about any particular form of expression, specifically around music. It's just another way of expressing some kind of human experience.
Mhm.
And it's just through their own lens and through their own experiences and through their own influences, this is where they have ended up. And no one style is more valid or less valid than another. It's just that's where it came from. Um, I think specifically with pop music, I think they see a little bit more of like a manufactured side of things, because at the end of the day, all music is all music that you buy, all music that you purchase, that you listen on the radio or things like that. It's manufactured as a product, and you can see that more so than any other style within the pop sphere. Like I was raised in the 90s with the big boy band, and like the boy bands, that's all they were. Like they didn't necessarily have a big art statement. They didn't necessarily have a big political thing. They were there to sell records. It was a Simon Cowell that had put five blokes together to harmonize with one another that somebody else wrote the music for. But the fact that people still listen to it and still got some kind of enjoyment out of it doesn't make it any worse. It's kind of like candy versus a burger versus a salad. They're all good food. It's just how you consume it and why you consume it. So I can understand stigma specifically around pop music, but I think now there's less of that purely manufactured pop music. And that's part of the reason why I love Taylor Swift, is because she's the one that writes all of her songs. She doesn't have a songwriter or a lyricist. She'll collaborate and work off of a producer for the sounds to develop, but there's a lot more like authenticity within it that I think pop music of the 90s and 2000s was kind of missing. And you could see that with the sales of the records. Because people could see through that and people wanted something a little bit more. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded way of answering all that, I guess.
Yeah, no, I then again, I love that you don't confine yourself to one genre, because it's not
Mhm.
like I think I've met, not personally, but I've seen a lot of progressive rock fans on the internet, and
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of them sometimes don't allow themselves to really branch out, but I think it's always good to branch out, because even prog can't satisfy every single maybe mood that you're in, because
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's meant, prog is a genre that is so eclectic, and has, it's a melting pot of all sorts of different genres, but I feel like even
Yeah.
then it's nice to have more straightforward kind of pop music once in a while, or even straightforward rock or whatever.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of my side projects that I do is a podcast called Quid Prog Quo, where I introduce my friends and loved ones to progressive rock music, and then they get me to listen to an album that they love. And the whole reason behind that was less of me showcasing progressive rock and like, spreading the gospel of the good word. It was me showing those prog elitists that, hey, popular music that people love can be good too. Because I found so many of my favorite artists through that means and that medium. Like I found Orville Peck, I found Lana Del Rey, I found all these artists that I love and adore and have multiple, records from them in my collection now. Um, because you have to be open to other expressions and other experiences. And by closing it off and being like, no, I'm only listening to prog, that's all I'm listening to, you are robbing yourself of what could be your next favorite artist. So
And I'm not afraid to say I used to be that. I used to be like,
I used to be that too.
yeah.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes people are, no matter what. But it's, I think the more I think one of the reasons I love like neo prog so much
Mm-hmm.
is because it's very accessible. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it
Oh,
has like a
absolutely.
poppy element. It's like it takes the poppy and theatrical elements of prog and like puts it together in one kind of
Mm-hmm.
style. At least that's how I think of it. But and
Absolutely.
I know you really I know you've mentioned a couple times that neo prog is one of your favorite like subgenres of prog.
Which prog?
Neo prog. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
love it.
Um, Now I believe IQ is your favorite of those
Yeah,
artists.
I would
Yeah,
say that.
yeah. It's funny because out of all the neo prog bands I've listened to, not neo. I love IQ. I absolutely love them, but I've always gravitated more towards well, Marillion, I think, yeah, obviously,
Sure.
but also even like it's funny. I interviewed both of these groups recently, Pendragon, Nick Barrett, and
Mm-hmm.
Galahad, which I
Yep.
absolutely love. Um, I I will ask this question: do you prefer 70s progressive rock or post 70s progressive rock?
Ooh. Depends on my mood, honestly. Um, I've run into this thing where because I've listened to so much like 70s prog, um, at this point, like because I've practically memorized all those records, I don't go back to them as much. Like I'll get in a mood where I'm like, okay, I want to listen to Genesis, or I'll get into a mood where I'm like, yeah, I want to listen to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But more often than not, I will be looking for things that are coming out within the past decade. Um, and I think I've been moved more from bands and artists post the 70s than I have from bands and artists from the 70s. Like they were the ones that changed my life for sure. Like that was where I fell in love with music and just found my favorite records and albums. But yeah, the ones that have like really moved me and I've connected with more that I listen to kind of come post 70s. So it's in the one hand, it's a little apples to oranges. Um, and I don't know. I think it's what the mood will strike me at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was on Reddit one time. I don't use it anymore, but I
Yeah.
was on the progressive rock r slash progressive rock, and there was like it seems like most people say oh yeah, 70s prog was the peak, and and personally I think Marillion and even the Flower Kings are
Hmm.
great. Bands like Pendragon just released an EP that's fantastic. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, the Flower Kings and Marillion are, I think, just as good, if not maybe even possibly better than Genesis. I know it's crazy, but
No, no, that's fair.
because Genesis, they had that one really strong decade in the 70s. Like they
Hmm.
had the 70s, which was like amazing, and even
Hmm.
the 80s stuff I really like. It just I think other bands like Marillion are a bit more consistent. I know some
Hmm.
people totally disagree with that, but I just
That's fair.
personally I find that to be what I gravitate more towards. But and also I want to make sure that I say this in case I forget. But
Yeah.
uh, it was probably like early 2019 because my birthday is February 14th,
Hmm.
and it was 2019, and my brother, I don't know if you remember this, my brother commented, I think it was on your Wind and Wuthering classic album review, and he
Okay.
said, oh, my this is when you had Patreon and you like shouted out people on Patreon, but you just very kindly responded and was like to his comment, which said, "Oh, can you shout out my brother? His birthday is coming. Big fan
Oh,
of your
right.
channel." And you said, "Oh yeah, sure." And it was on the ELO worst to best. You at the very end, and I was surprised it was on a worst to best, because that's like typically the videos that get a lot of views.
And that's why I did it, because I didn't want to bury it with like a small like album review that gets 300. I wanted to put it on one that will get the most amount of eyes. So yeah.
that I that is so nice. That is so
Yeah.
incredibly generous. I cannot thank you
Yeah, of
enough.
course.
And when I saw that, I wasn't expecting it. I of course, as I did at the time, I watched your videos right after school when I came back, and I turned it on, and at the end of the video was coming up, and I was about to turn it off, and then you said, "Oh yeah, by the way, it's a happy birthday to Franklin," and I was like, "What?" You know, I was like, I had no idea that was going to happen, and then my dad was like sitting right by me doing his own thing, and he knew about it, but he
Mhm.
like faked a reaction, like, "Oh my gosh, what's happening?" And it was really funny, and really cool, because I had um then again, I didn't know that that would happen. Like, I had no idea about that. So yeah, I just have to
Right.
thank you for that so
Oh,
much.
absolutely.
And then again, can't express just how influential you are in terms of my musical journey. And of course, music is kind of my life, right? It's everything.
Absolutely.
It's kind of, if you were to boil me down to what I am intrinsically,
Hmm.
it's a musician, right? And a
Hmm.
music
Hmm.
lover, right? So yeah, I just have to thank you for that.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
I will ask a question, and I've thought about this a lot, because
Sure.
it's unfortunate, because as of recently, a lot of the bands that I like are bands that have existed probably since the latest, like the 90s, you know? So
Okay.
I mean, I know there's bands that have come out after that. I think there's some bands that I like that have come like post 2000s, but or post 90s or whatever. But
Hmm.
I was gonna ask this: is do you think progressive rock is a dying art?
Hmm.
And can you see this genre continuing 50 to 100 years from now?
Right. I mean, we were kind of touching a little bit upon it when, you were saying that the height of progressive rock was in the 70s, or at least that's what people were kind of saying on Reddit and the internet. And in some respects, they weren't wrong, because in terms of popularity, in terms of financial success, and in terms of like selling out the big venues, the mid 70s was kind of the peak. You had like all of these big prog acts selling out big venues like Madison Square Garden. Genesis and Queen are selling out like Wembley Stadium and things like that. And I don't think where we are currently, I don't know if we'll ever get to that again. And I've made a couple of like opinion pieces about that, of like until popular artists start embracing some of the things that made prog what prog is. I don't think we're going to get to that same level. And I don't think any genre outside of what we would consider pop, which is just popular music, I don't think any genre is going to get to that level of popularity. I'm also a huge metal fan, and I don't think metal is going to get to that same level of popularity that they experienced in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And I think part of that is the blending of genres and the streaming world that we find ourselves in. Very few people that I know of listen to the radio anymore, and that was kind of one of the main ways of being introduced to new artists and new acts. With the gone are the days of MTV, or for me in Canada, Much Music, which would again have genre specific programming. So I think that style of popularity, I don't know if we'll ever kind of meet that same level, or if we do, it's going to be like genres coming and going, right? In terms of progressive rock, I don't know intrinsically if we'll ever see what we think of as progressive rock, but I can see other bands that use proggy elements kind of becoming popular. And I think we're seeing that currently with bands like the Black Midi, with bands like Black Country New Road, that kind of are prog adjacent, or are using like the prog ideas to kind of create new music. And that was one of the very unique things about the 70s prog, is because they were both inventive and defining what the genre was. It's kind of like in Inception, where it's like observing and creating are a tandem process. And that's kind of what I think progressive rock was in the 70s. And now we have two expressions of what progressive rock is: those that aren't moving the music forward but are using the techniques that were found in the 70s, versus those bands that are producing music that doesn't sound like progressive rock music but are moving the music forward and are using the ideology of what prog is of. So I would love to see the day where that becomes much more in vogue. And I think slowly we're starting to get there with bands like Coldplay and Taylor Swift doing tracks that are well within 10 minutes. Because that was something that was essentially unheard of outside of the 80s. Here's these bands that are putting it out. I love the fact that somebody was like, oh, Taylor Swift put out the first top 10 track that was 10 minutes long. And I'm like, yeah, that's great for her, but like Thick as a Brick is like 45 minutes long, and it was super popular back in the 70s.
Oh,
So I would love to see the day where that happens. I don't know if we'll ever get to that same level that we had in the 70s. In fact, I think more people now are listening to prog than they were in the 70s, but it's not as popular because we don't hear it quite as much on the radio ways or on movies or on soundtracks or things like that. But I think more people are listening to it.
yeah, because I think the most recent band in terms of when they formed that I still like consistently listen to, this might shock some people, but like Arena, which formed in like
Sure.
1995. So like almost 30 years, almost
Yeah.
30 years. And um, I don't really know many bands after that. I mean, what is it? Anubis. I listen to them a little bit.
Yep. Yep.
Some other bands, and they're kind of more recent. But yeah, and I forgot to mention with that Reddit comment, they added something at the end. This was the thing I disagreed with. I didn't disagree with the part that they said where 70s was the peak. They said after it, they were like, oh, and music since then hasn't come close to that. Well, I don't know if they're talking in terms of popularity, but I think in terms of quality of music, I think it has come very close. But that's just
I would
me.
agree to that.
Yeah,
No, I would agree to that.
yeah. Um, now, this is in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
I was fortunate to see Genesis on their The Last Domino tour, which was,
So good.
yeah. Oh my gosh, it was so
Yeah.
great. Yeah,
I unfortunately missed it. And I shouldn't say unfortunately. I didn't want to taint my experience with seeing Genesis live back in 2007 with their Turn It On Again tour.
mhm.
But it was also just financially infeasible for me, unfortunately. It was just a little
Well,
expensive.
it was very expensive for me. I live in Wisconsin, and
Uh-huh.
I had to fly to North Carolina because it was my mom was very concerned about it has to be on a weekend. Like she didn't want me to
Mm-hmm.
miss like school
Mm-hmm.
because that was like a something
For
whatever.
sure.
But it was actually it was my favorite concert of all time.
That's go so
And
great.
Phil Collins sounded so good. He sounded great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many people were like, oh, they're old. They shouldn't continue. No, they sound great. They sound
Yeah.
incredible. Yeah, they had like backing vocals, and yeah, they had to lower the songs and in the key that they were in, but it sounded so good. And I was genuinely moved throughout the whole thing. But
Mm-hmm.
was there ever a concert that you went to where you would say it was your favorite concert?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many at this point that it's so hard to pick just one, but I think the one for me there were three that were the most memorable. Um, the first was the one that got me into progressive rock, which was the third concert I saw. My dad took me to see the Musical Box, which was the Genesis tribute band, and they did their Selling England by the Pound tour. Listening to the First the Fifth really for the first time in that setting, just that's the one that changed my life. Like that moment, hearing First the Fifth, I walked out of that just completely a different person. Um, but so if that was the one that like really got me into prog, the one that I think was the most enjoyable and the one that I still kind of come back to and think extremely favorably upon was when I saw Haken for the first time. They they did their North American tour. It was the first time they did North American tour, and they had just released restoration. Um, and it was like this dingy bar. It was the Hard Luck on College Street in Toronto. So there's like maybe 50 of us in this like fire hazard trap of a room. And it blew me away because they played like Crystallized and Visions. They played most of the Mountain and most of like, but what really got me was their opening band of Next to None, was Max Portnoy's band. And so before, like I knew that Next to None was opening, but I didn't know the significance of the band. And so because there's only like 25 of us in this room and like you can touch anybody that's on the stage, Mike Portnoy just walks out onto the stage and he's just like, "Hey guys, this is my son's band, so be nice to them." And I'm like, that is Mike Portnoy. And I could reach and like touch his belly. And Next to None was amazing. I'm so saddened that they haven't done anything else. Their second album was just so freaking good. So that album, like that concert, is still extremely memorable to me. So those two kind of fight, like one helped define me. One was the one that just like I was so shocked and so blown away for. And then like I would say whatever was the last concert that I saw is always like my favorite one of that time.
Yeah.
So so those are always my three. It's like the Genesis one that started it all, the Haken concert that just blew me away, and then whatever it was that I saw last.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I had a similar experience when I saw Steve Hackett's band live. They did, it was on the Selling England by the Pound. Well, it was the
Yeah.
Spectrum Warnings 40th anniversary, or 40th anniversary tour, and he also played Selling England by the Pound in its entirety. And that was even it was kind of cool because I wasn't even a fan of because I think Jonas Ringgold played bass for that, and
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I didn't even really know him, and now I'm a huge fan of him. So I wish I could go back and really appreciate seeing him because I'm a huge fan of him. He's one of my favorite bass players, but also just seeing
Oh,
that,
absolutely. Yeah.
seeing those songs being played live. I love Spectrum Mornings. I love Song by the Pound. I know I love at the time the new album that he released, which I'm forgetting what it's called. Something 2019, whatever album that was. It has
Was that the Night Siren?
no, it has the song
Just going through my head here of 2019.
Wait, I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately. But yeah, it's such a great album. It has like Underground Railroad and those songs, Silent Golden something. It's so good, and I that was another favorite of mine. I'm gonna have to maybe sacrifice some questions here, but now personally, what do you? I can see why you despise Abacab, but
okay.
To the degree that you do, I'm wondering like why is it far and away the worst album that they've done for you? I'm just curious.
Oh, that's okay. So with Duke, with the release of Duke, it was the perfect blending of pop and prog. And I felt as like at that point, I felt like they could go in two different directions. They could continue on with their prog stuff, take prog more into the 80s, or they can go very accessible pop. And they ended up doing neither of that and just decided to do, I still don't know, like very electronical, very like new wave. And I read somewhere recently that Phil made a bet with Mike and Tony, like, hey, we can record and produce an album within 24 hours. And that was what Abacab was. And it's like, yeah, because like they had this massive momentum with Duke, because Duke is one of my favorites of theirs. And they just kind of squandered it. And I felt like it wasn't really until Invisible Touch that we got to that same level of balance. Like their self-titled still suffered a little bit from the Abacab monster. like the first side is very proggy. The second side, they didn't quite know what to do with in terms of like the more poppy side of things. Um, and so for me, it was seeing the big promise and seeing the growth and development of this band going into the 80s, kind of developing past their prog influences and really bringing their music more into the pop side of things and fumbling the ball so hard. Because and I think that for me is why I find it's their worst, and I also just find it unlistenable. I don't know the kinds of sounds that Tony is putting on the keyboards, like the synth sounds don't sound good. And I get like certain bands have that kind of like gnarly sound on the keyboards to make a statement, but I think the statement was just I couldn't find a better sound. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that album. I still go on the record to say it's their worst. And I mean, there's a reason why within their past like 3 or 4 tours, like since the 90s, really, they haven't played any of the tracks live from that album,
Yeah, it's
to my knowledge.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, personally, I think Three Sides Live. I like some of the renditions of those Abacab songs on that album. Like the title track, I think is better than the
Sure.
studio version, much better in a live context.
Yeah.
And if you take like one of their most hated songs, "Who Done It," which I find that to be a really funny song, especially live. I find
It's a
it's
yeah,
entertaining. It's entertaining.
it's entertaining. I don't, and if it was just kind of like a one-off or a B-side or something like that, I think I could grow to like it, but I don't know, it's just so bad. Like this was supposed to be their big punk song and it just sounds god awful.
Yeah.
Um
Personally,
and
yeah. Sorry.
no, go for it. Go
Oh,
for it.
sorry. Personally, there are other songs that I think are far worse. Personally, I despise like the way you despise Abacab as an album. I despise Illegal Alien as a song. I
It's not a good song. It's not a good song.
yeah, no, I absolutely despise that song, or even I Can't Dance, right? Which is I for me, Who Done It, I can see the intent and I can see the funny side of the band, like Harold the Barrel or something, right? Like
Sure,
that's
sure.
like a funny song. I kind of see Who Done It as like the '80s version of Harold the Barrel, but it's just
Okay,
like
I
the
can
other
see that.
songs that I mentioned, I just don't get whatsoever the intent behind it, the how it's supposed to be good. But yeah, it was just funny. Now, I'm just going to quickly, I'm going to bunch these last 2 questions into one, just as
Sure.
last 2 questions. They're both YouTube related questions because I myself have just started like well, I didn't just start YouTube. I started uh well, I one of my biggest YouTube videos, it has 14K, which for me is like a lot.
That's pretty good. That's
I don't
pretty
know,
good.
for me that's a lot. But
Yeah.
it was a cover that I did of a guitar cover of the musical Box by Genesis. I
Okay.
played it on guitar and played it with the music, and it has it's funny because I've grown a lot since then as a guitar player, and it has an overwhelming amount of like positive comments. But I just had a couple of YouTube questions that I wanted to ask. One, how do you deal with negative comments? And 2, do you have any advice for small YouTubers like myself who want to grow their channel?
Oh geez. Um I mean, when I first started my YouTube, this was almost 10 years ago. And the rule of thumb was don't read the comments, like don't read the comics. I always push back on that because I feel as though like over half of the negative comments are people that are trying to give constructive criticism, trying to make, because I feel as though people will want to actually make do their best to give advice to make albums like the videos better. So I always read them to get advice on how I could make it better. And so that's a good advice for anybody starting off, especially when you're first starting off. And I maybe I'm very naive, but I always like to think that people have the best intentions in mind when they're putting out those comments. Even if for me it's how to pronounce all the different words that I can't pronounce. I know that they're acting in good faith, and I know, some of it is a little bit tongue in cheek. But I think my best way to combat against the negativity is to always have a file at your fingertips with all of the good and important comments that you've received, both heartwarming from strangers, but also positive comments from people that you admire. I've gotten comments and had the opportunity to interview people that I strongly admire. So I continuously go back to a little file that I remind myself, hey, remember when this person told you this? Remember when this person did this, right? Even this little interview with you saying all those nice words, like I am constantly filing those into the back of my mind so that when I read more of those comments of being like, oh, you're useless, you're worthless, blah, 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 I'll be like, yeah, but Franklin said I was cool. So that's all I really need to worry about. Um, so that helps and it pays dividends in the end. So yeah, and just never, in terms of advice, you know, always chase the passion and not the trends. So, and that was something that I had to really remind myself of because I was bending myself over backwards to try to do a lot of these worst to best because those were the ones giving me the 50 to 100,000 views. But I just found my heart wasn't quite in it. And so instead of bringing myself out and trying to do another worst to best like every quarter, I was doing things that brought me more like that my passion was fueling. So more tier lists, more collaboration with people that I enjoy working with, more how to get into if I wanted to look at a band within their full discography. And yeah, allow that to dictate what you pour your energy into rather than just chasing the trends that you know will get you the views. So yeah, that's my advice.
Yeah, and I mean, fortunately, I'm surprised I don't have more negative comments because it's actually overwhelmingly positive, especially on the more popular ones. But there's a couple comments where it's like kind of tongue in cheek, or it's like, well,
Yeah,
you don't really take offense to it because it's like somebody saying, "I hate your blue hair" when you don't have blue hair, right? It's like
exactly,
it doesn't mean
exactly.
anything. And
Yeah, and honestly, at the end of the day, it shows a lot more about the person rather than you.
exactly, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I just wanted to basically ask about that because I kind of have recently been trying to upload more and kind of I would like to grow my channel. I don't know if I would ever get to. I doubt I would ever get to your level, because you're
Don't
kind of a
I would say don't doubt it. I didn't think I
yeah
would be anywhere near where I am now. So
yeah
yeah.
exactly. But thank you so much for this interview. I'm so honored to speak with you. Just somebody who's you're as influential to me as some of my absolute favorite musicians, right? Because you're
Oh,
the person who introduced me to them. So it's like it's kind of
right.
like I view you in a very high regard just because of your influence on me. And yeah, thank you so much for your time and everything
Oh,
like that.
absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was so good. Thank you for all those kind words. And I look forward to see where your videos take you.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, I'll hopefully see you another time. Yes.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.